A man survived the sinking of the Titanic. 3 years later, according to his family, he survived another maritime disaster when the Lusitania was torpedoed during the First World War. His name was George William Beauchamp. If the story is true, he survived two of the most famous ship disasters of the early 20th century, but there is a problem. The Titanic part of his story is firmly documented. The Lusitania part is based mainly on family testimony and later reporting, and historians have not been able to establish it with the same certainty. That uncertainty makes the story even more interesting, because in 1912, George Beauchamp was definitely aboard the Titanic when it struck an iceberg, and he did not simply escape unnoticed. He gave evidence about the disaster to the official British inquiry. He described the water rising around him. He helped passengers into a lifeboat, and from that lifeboat, he watched one of the largest ships in the world disappear into the Atlantic. Then 3 years later, his family says he found himself aboard another famous liner facing another catastrophe. To understand how extraordinary that would have been, we have to go back to the beginning. George William Beauchamp was born on March 9, 1888 in Totton, Hampshire, England. He grew up around the sea. Like many working-class men in southern England, he found employment connected to ships. By the early 20th century, he was working as a fireman. Despite the name, a ship's fireman was not someone fighting fires. Firemen worked in the engine department, feeding coal into the furnaces that produced steam for the ship's engines. It was exhausting work. The engine rooms were hot, noisy, and physically demanding. A fireman could spend hours working below deck while passengers enjoyed the comfortable areas above. Beauchamp had experience at sea before he joined the Titanic. Then, in April 1912, he became part of the crew of a ship that was about to become famous for all the wrong reasons. The RMS Titanic was preparing for its maiden voyage from Southampton to New York. At the time, Titanic was one of the largest and most impressive passenger ships ever built. It was designed to carry thousands of people across the Atlantic in comfort. For Beauchamp, however, Titanic was a workplace. He boarded at Southampton on April 4, 1912. He was 24 years old. 5 days later, Titanic left Southampton. The ship stopped at Cherbourg in France and Queenstown, now known as Cobb, in Ireland. Then it headed west into the Atlantic. For the first few days, there was nothing to suggest that the voyage would become one of the most famous disasters in history. The ship moved through the ocean. Passengers ate meals, they walked the decks, crew members worked their shifts. And below them, men like George Beauchamp continued feeding the furnaces that kept the ship moving. Then came April 14. Titanic was traveling through a region of the North Atlantic where ice had been reported. The weather was cold. The sea was relatively calm. Visibility was difficult because there was little moonlight. At about 11:40 that night, Titanic struck an iceberg. For passengers in the upper parts of the ship, the impact was strange rather than immediately terrifying. But below deck, the situation was becoming serious. Beauchamp was in the engine department. According to his testimony at the later inquiry, water began rising around him. At one point, he described the water as reaching as high as his waist. The men below were trying to carry out their orders while the ship's condition deteriorated. Then Beauchamp was told that he could leave. He made his way upward. He eventually reached the boat deck, but getting to the surface did not mean he was safe. Titanic had more than 2,000 people aboard but carried lifeboats for only a fraction of them. There was not enough space for everyone. The evacuation became chaotic. Beauchamp reached the starboard side of the ship. There he helped women and children into lifeboat 13. He did not immediately leave himself. He helped load the boat. Eventually, he climbed aboard. The lifeboat was lowered toward the dark Atlantic, and now George Beauchamp was sitting in a small open boat beside the enormous Titanic. The ship was sinking. He and the other people in the lifeboat had to pull away from the vessel. There was a danger that they could be drawn toward the sinking ship. Beauchamp later explained to investigators that they rowed away to escape the suction as Titanic went down. Then he watched. The ship's bow disappeared first. The stern remained visible. For a moment, the enormous ship still seemed to tower above the water. Then the stern disappeared too. Beauchamp later described the sound as being like thunder. He could hear cries from people still in the water, but the lifeboat was already full. There was little they could do. Lifeboat 13 drifted away into the darkness. Hours later, the RMS Carpathia arrived. The Carpathia had raced through the night after receiving Titanic's distress calls. It rescued the survivors from the lifeboats. Beauchamp was among them. On April 18, he arrived in New York aboard Carpathia, but his involvement with the Titanic disaster did not end there. Because he was a member of the crew, Beauchamp was later called to give evidence before the British inquiry into the sinking. This is one of the reasons his Titanic story is so well documented. We do not have to rely only on a family story told decades later. We have his testimony. We know his name. We know his occupation. We know he was aboard Titanic. We know he escaped in Lifeboat 13, and we know he survived. But then something extraordinary is said to have happened. 3 years later, another huge passenger liner was sailing across the Atlantic. Her name was RMS Lusitania. By 1915, however, the world had changed. The First World War was underway. Germany was using submarines to attack ships connected to the Allied war effort. Lusitania was a British ocean liner operating between New York and Liverpool. She carried passengers, crew, and cargo. On May 7, 1915, Lusitania was sailing near the southern coast of Ireland. A German submarine, U-20, spotted the ship. The submarine fired a torpedo. The weapon struck Lusitania. The ship was badly damaged. A second explosion followed. Lusitania sank rapidly. Around 1,200 people died. Among the dead were more than 100 Americans. The sinking caused international outrage and became one of the most famous maritime disasters of the First World War, and according to George Beauchamp's family, he was there. If that claim is correct, Beauchamp had now survived 2 disasters involving famous ocean liners. Titanic in 1912, Lusitania in 1915, but this is where the story becomes difficult. There is no doubt that George Beauchamp survived Titanic. There is no doubt that he continued working at sea afterward, but the evidence connecting him to Lusitania is much weaker. The claim was reported publicly decades later, based largely on family recollections. It has not been established in the same way as his Titanic service. That means we should be careful when saying that George Beauchamp definitely survived both ships. A more accurate description is that he is believed by his family and some later reports to have survived both disasters. And that distinction matters, because there is another famous story about a man supposedly surviving Titanic and Lusitania. His name is often given as Frank Tower, sometimes Frank Towers. According to the legend, he survived Titanic, the Empress of Ireland, and Lusitania. It sounds almost impossible, and researchers have found serious problems with the story. There is no Frank Tower on the Titanic crew list. There is also no reliable evidence placing him aboard the other ships. The legend appears to have grown from confusion involving real sailors, newspaper reports, and similar names. One real Lusitania survivor was a fireman named Francis Toner. His surname was sometimes reported incorrectly. Some researchers believe that stories about Toner may have helped create the later Frank Tower legend, so George Beauchamp should not be confused with that story. He was a real Titanic survivor. His name appears in the historical records. He gave evidence at the inquiry, and he genuinely survived one of the most famous shipwrecks in history. The question is whether he was also aboard Lusitania. His family believed he was. But the surviving evidence does not allow us to say it with the same confidence. And even without Lusitania, Beauchamp's Titanic experience was extraordinary. He had been deep inside the ship when it struck the iceberg. He had watched water rise around him. He had escaped from the engine department. He had helped passengers into Lifeboat 13, and then he had watched Titanic sink. Most people who survived that night never wanted to go through anything similar again. But Beauchamp continued working at sea. That decision is important. The Titanic disaster did not immediately end his career as a sailor. He continued working on ships for years. He eventually served on vessels operating between Britain and South Africa. He worked as a fireman and remained connected to the sea later. He settled in Southampton and worked as a docker. His life after Titanic was far less famous than the night of April 14, 1912, and that may be one reason the Lusitania story survived mainly through family memory. Beauchamp did not become a celebrity. He did not spend the rest of his life appearing in newspapers. He simply continued living. He married, he worked, he grew older, and the world around him changed. The First World War ended. The 1920s arrived. Then came the Great Depression. Then another world war. Beauchamp lived through all of it. He died in April 1965 at the age of 77 by then. More than half a century had passed since Titanic sank. The little-known fireman from Totten had become an old man, but the story of the ships he survived was still there. And that is what makes George Beauchamp so fascinating. The most unbelievable part of his story is not necessarily the claim that he survived 2 famous disasters. It is the fact that the first one is so thoroughly documented. We can trace his movements. We can read his testimony. We can follow him from the engine room to the lifeboat. We know that he watched Titanic disappear, and then we are left with a mystery. Did the same man really survive Lusitania 3 years later? His family said yes. Some newspapers reported the claim, but the documentary evidence is not strong enough to turn the claim into an established fact. That uncertainty should not ruin the story. It makes it more honest. History is not always a collection of perfect answers. Sometimes there is a solid fact surrounded by a question mark. George Beauchamp was definitely on Titanic. He definitely survived. He definitely continued working at sea. And his family believed he later survived Lusitania. If they were right, then Beauchamp experienced something almost impossible to imagine. He would have been aboard 2 legendary ocean liners that sank in 2 different disasters only 3 years apart. Titanic struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic. Lusitania was attacked during wartime. The circumstances were completely different, but both ships became symbols of their era, and Beauchamp, if the family account is correct, escaped both. There is another reason his story stands out on Titanic. Beauchamp was not merely a passenger who happened to survive. He was part of the crew. His work placed him deep inside the ship. When the disaster began, he had to make his way from the engine spaces toward the upper decks. Then instead of simply jumping into a lifeboat, he helped other people get aboard. He was still standing on the ship while Lifeboat 13 was being loaded. He eventually entered it himself. And that lifeboat became his path to survival. Years later, the story of Titanic would become larger than life. Books would be written, films would be made. The ship would become one of the most famous objects in modern history, but George Beauchamp remembered it as something much more immediate, a workplace, a ship that suddenly began filling with water, a lifeboat, a dark ocean, and the sound of the vessel disappearing, then perhaps another ship, another disaster, another escape. Whether that second survival can ever be fully proven is something historians must leave open, but there is no uncertainty about the first part. George William Beauchamp survived the Titanic. He entered the ship as a 24-year-old fireman. He left it in Lifeboat 13 and he lived for another 53 years. His story reminds us that behind the famous names of great disasters were ordinary people whose lives continued long after the headlines disappeared. Some became famous, others disappeared into ordinary life. George Beauchamp did both, in a way. For one night, he was at the center of the greatest maritime disaster of his time, then he went back to work. And if his family's account of the Lusitania is correct, the sea came back for him one more time. 2 legendary ships, 2 disasters, 1 survivor. But even if history can only prove one of those escapes beyond doubt, George Beauchamp's life remains extraordinary, because surviving Titanic once was enough to make a lifetime story. The possibility that he survived Lusitania too simply makes that story almost impossible to forget.